Today, I bring you a charming new mystery featuring none other than the brilliant Hercule Poirot, the world's most famous Belgian detective, created by Agatha Christie. This case is filled with twists, clever clues, and Poirot's signature little grey cells at work. Make yourself comfortable, and let's unravel this elegant puzzle together. And if you'd like, leave a quick comment and tell me where you're joining from. It's always a pleasure to know where our little detective community is tuning in from. Now let's get started. The sun shone with a golden clarity peculiar to the French Riviera, and the sea beyond our balcony sparkled as though every ripple had been dusted with diamond. Hercule Poirot sat in a cane chair beneath a striped umbrella, a checked blanket over his knees, and a soft silk handkerchief tucked neatly in the breast pocket of his pale grey suit. We had arrived 2 days prior, having been urged by Dr. Lavigny, at Poirot's insistence on a second opinion, to spend at least a fortnight away from the damp London air. My old friend had suffered nothing more than a minor chill, but naturally, he had declared it a grievous insult to the little grey cells. "I am not ill, Hastings," he sniffed that morning, sipping his chamomile tea. "I am merely recovering from the trauma of tolerating mediocrity in Scotland Yard for too long." "Rest," I said firmly, handing him a newspaper. "Doctor's orders." He accepted the paper with the theatrical reluctance of a man agreeing to exile. Pah! I shall rest, but I do not intend to grow moss. And yet the setting could not have been more idyllic for idleness. The Hôtel des Vagues was an opulent old place with domed ceilings, a mahogany piano in the lobby, and a concierge with a moustache nearly as fine as Poirot's. We were booked in for 10 days, and I confess the thought of long strolls, warm nights, and endless card games had filled me with cheer. Poirot, of course, was already growing restless. That morning, he eyed the activity across the promenade with growing interest. "And that," he said, pointing with his rolled-up newspaper, "is the Casino Lucien. I believe they have roulette, baccarat, and perhaps intrigue." I groaned inwardly. So much for rest. That evening, after some light debate, by which I mean Poirot ultimately got his way, we made our way to the famed Casino Lucien, a towering edifice of white stone and glass that glittered like a wedding cake under the evening lights. Inside, it was all soft velvet and hushed voices. Waiters in white gloves moved discreetly between tables, where fortunes whispered away with every flick of a wrist. Poirot, to my surprise, did not head straight for the roulette wheel, but stood at the top of the grand staircase, surveying the floor like a general about to enter battle. And it was then that the real performance began. A hush fell over the room as a tall, silver-haired gentleman rose from a table near the centre of the hall. I recognized him from the society pages. Reginald Vance, the billionaire magnate known equally for his brilliance and his ego. His presence turned heads, not just because of the crisp midnight blue tuxedo he wore, but because of the boldness in his voice. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, raising a glass, "tonight I place my final wager." There was a smattering of amused applause. He smiled, wolf-like. "Not just chips, not just cards, but everything. A wager against fate, against time itself. A final bet before I retire from the world stage." Poirot tilted his head. "Melodramatic, wouldn't you say?" I whispered. Poirot's moustache twitched. "Mais non, Hastings. A man does not speak in metaphors at a roulette table unless he is gambling with more than money." Around Vance stood a small cluster, each of them impeccably dressed, and yet distinctly apart from one another. A woman in pearls who seemed not to look directly at her husband. A lean, hawk-eyed man with a glass of brandy and clenched fists. A younger man with a gambler's slouch. A woman with a scarf tied too tightly around her throat, and a dark-eyed concierge standing slightly behind them all, watching everyone. It was, Poirot murmured, a gathering of masks. I did not yet understand what he meant. Later that evening, we dined on the terrace adjoining the casino, and to my delight, and Poirot's internal delight, though he pretended otherwise, Vance and his entourage took the table just across from ours. The atmosphere, despite the warm evening and soft candlelight, was taut with invisible threads. The younger man, Julian Arkwright, I remembered from somewhere, leaned in and laughed a little too loudly. "You'll shock them all, Reggie. What's the bet this time? Russian roulette?" Vance chuckled. "Let's just say, Julian, I've staked something far more meaningful than bullets." The woman beside him, Camille, his wife, perhaps, stirred her soup without tasting it. She wore a brooch of sapphires, dazzling in the light, but her eyes were elsewhere, as if counting stars only she could see. Opposite them sat Victor Layton, former business partner turned tabloid adversary, who sipped his drink and said nothing. But his eyes narrowed whenever Vance spoke. Next to him, a striking older woman in deep green, Evelyn Drake, sighed theatrically. "You always did enjoy theatre, Reginald. But sometimes, darling, you mistake drama for destiny." Only the concierge, Luc Moreau, remained silent, serving with meticulous precision and a faint smile. Yet I saw him glance at Vance once, as if waiting for something. Poirot leaned toward me. "Regardez, Hastings. They have not come for a dinner. They have come for a reckoning." I chuckled. "You're imagining things." He did not reply, but in the flicker of candlelight, his eyes had already begun their work. It was just past midnight when the note arrived. I had returned from the terrace and found Poirot seated by the window in our suite, an untouched cup of hot chocolate at his elbow and a small frown of dissatisfaction on his brow. "You are restless," I observed. "Naturellement," he replied without looking at me. "I am troubled, mon ami, not by illness, but by atmosphere. The air at that casino, it crackled, yes, like the static before a storm. And our Monsieur Vance, he makes a declaration that is not theatrical, but fatalistic. It was not the cry of the peacock, Hastings. It was the cry of the man who sees the end." Before I could respond, there came a sound. Slip. Something slid beneath our door. Poirot rose at once. "Aha," he said softly. "And here comes the thunder." He retrieved the envelope and held it delicately between two fingers. There was no name, no seal, only a single sheet of paper folded inside. I leaned closer and read over his shoulder. "He is playing with death, Monsieur Poirot. Stop him if you can." There was no signature, no mark, no clue to the sender. Just that single chilling sentence. Poirot's eyes narrowed. "You see, Hastings, someone else feels the storm. And it is not only I who suspects that the final bet of Monsieur Vance may not be of his own choosing." "What should we do?" I asked. Poirot tucked the note into his breast pocket and looked out at the night. "We wait, mon ami. For now, we observe. And tomorrow, I think, the cards will be on the table." Morning came too brightly. The Riviera sun had barely risen above the hills when a knock came at our door. Sharp, urgent, and unmistakably official. It was the hotel manager, flanked by a gendarme. His face was pale and clammy as an oyster. "There has been an unfortunate incident," he began. "Monsieur Vance has been found. He is dead." I blinked. "Dead? But we just saw him last night. He was—" Poirot raised a hand. "Where was he found?" "In his private suite. The door was locked from the inside. No sign of forced entry. We believe it was suicide." Poirot did not move, but his expression altered minutely. He exchanged a glance with me, then turned to the manager. "You will permit us to see the room?" The manager hesitated. The gendarme, to my surprise, nodded. Monsieur Poirot's reputation precedes him. The suite was opulent, dark wood panelling, a grand piano, and thick velvet curtains drawn to keep out the morning sun. Reginald Vance lay slumped in an armchair by the window, a glass of brandy at his side. The faint smell of almonds lingered in the air. The doctor, already present, pronounced it cyanide. A vial sat on the writing desk. A note, unsigned, read simply, "The final bet is lost." "It looks clear enough," the officer said. "He was despondent. He lost heavily last night. Perhaps this was planned." Poirot bent to examine the scene. He did not touch anything, of course not, but his eyes missed nothing. "Ah," he murmured, "and yet, the glass is placed in the left hand. Monsieur Vance was right-handed, was he not?" I frowned. "Does it matter?" Poirot turned to me, eyes gleaming. "Mon ami, you think, but you do not observe. Suicide is convenient, but it is rarely tidy. And this," he gestured to the room, "is too tidy." He stepped back and adjusted his tie. "Non, Hastings. This is not the end of a man defeated. This is the end game of a man who was winning." The morning following the discovery of Reginald Vance's body was veiled in whispers, as the Riviera sun beamed down on the red-tiled roofs and whitewashed balconies of the Hôtel des Vagues. Inside, a pall of unease drifted from corridor to corridor like a lingering perfume. It was just after breakfast, Poirot, of course, having arranged his grapefruit wedges in perfect geometric symmetry, when we were summoned by a discreet knock at the door. The visitor was none other than Jacques Deroulard, director of the Casino Lucien, a man whose bow tie looked as if it had been ironed with mathematical precision. "Messieurs," he began, his voice soft and fastidious, "I come with a delicate proposition." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Ah, a proposition, monsieur? It is early in the day for business. Perhaps you mean intrigue?" Deroulard's moustache twitched, though it was no match for Poirot's. "There has been a terrible incident, as you know. The gendarmerie believes it to be suicide, but there are murmurs among the staff, among the clientele." Poirot leaned forward. "Whispers, monsieur, are often more honest than declarations. They come from the belly, not the brain." "I had hoped," Deroulard continued, carefully avoiding direct eye contact, "that you and your associate might remain within the casino for a few days. As observers, of course, unofficially. The guests trust you, Monsieur Poirot. Your presence might calm their nerves, or reveal what they will not tell the police." Poirot pressed his fingertips together. "So, you ask Hercule Poirot to play the part of the quiet mirror, oui? One who reflects but does not speak. A most unusual role. But for you, Monsieur Deroulard, and for the cause of truth, I accept I, of course, had questions of my own. Chief among them, why was the director of a casino so eager to hush up a supposed suicide?" As we followed Deroulard across the polished marble floors back to the scene of the crime, I couldn't shake the feeling that the cards were being dealt once again, but this time beneath the table. The widow received us in the garden lounge of the casino's private wing, a section reserved for VIP guests and high rollers, with its cream-coloured drapes, tall palm fronds, and the faint scent of honeysuckle trailing through the air. Camille Vance, now the wealthiest woman in the Riviera, perhaps in Europe, wore her mourning with elegance, but not with sorrow. She was dressed in black chiffon, a long veil pinned over auburn waves, and a single diamond bracelet on her left wrist that caught the sunlight like ice. Her eyes, however, remained cold, dry. "Thank you for coming, Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice low and even. "I suppose you are here to confirm what they all whisper behind my back, that I drove my husband to his end?" Poirot bowed gently. "Madame, I am here only to listen, to observe, and to ask the questions that whisper themselves in silence." She gestured toward a seat. "Ask then, He did not begin with the usual inquiries. Instead, he observed her fingers. Unsteady, not with grief, but tension. You were not at his side last night, madam. Camille's smile was tight. I have not been at Reggie's side for some time. We had grown apart. He preferred the company of gamblers and ghosts. You refer to Madame Evelyn Drake? Poirot asked delicately. Camille looked out at the gardens. He fancied her a prophetess, as if fortune-telling could replace fortune-building. And yet, madame, Poirot continued, your husband died with a glass in his hand, and the inheritance in yours. Forgive me, it is not a crime, merely efficient. Her eyes narrowed, but she said nothing. I shifted uncomfortably in my chair. It must be a shock, I offered, hoping to soften the atmosphere. It is, she said at last, though not for the reasons you think. Poirot stood. Grief, madame, is an actor with many faces, but the truth, it does not wear a veil. As we left, Poirot murmured to me, she is too composed, Hastings. A woman in mourning, who wears diamonds on the wrist, but none in her heart. If Camille was the winter rose, then Victor Layton was the thorn that never dropped. We found him in the casino's club room, nursing a brandy before noon, and staring into its depths as though it might offer absolution, or a better memory. He looked up with narrowed eyes when Poirot introduced us. The detective, I wondered when you'd arrive. Poirot smiled warmly. And I, monsieur, wondered how long it would take for you to look guilty of something, if not the crime. Layton chuckled, though it lacked warmth. Reggie and I were partners for 20 years, built 3 empires together. He cut me out of the 4th just last month. That hardly makes me a murderer. Poirot sat. Ah, but you see, motive is like the smoke from your cigar, monsieur. It rises, dissipates, but the scent lingers. I wasn't even here, Layton insisted. I left for Nice yesterday afternoon. Ask anyone. Anyone, Poirot asked mildly, or someone specific? There was a brief hesitation. I spoke to my assistant by telephone. She can confirm. Poirot tilted his head. Ah, but you see, Hastings and I, how do you say, strolled the promenade last evening, and we saw you. Layton's fingers tightened around the glass. Perhaps, he admitted. I returned briefly. I wanted to speak to Vance, one final attempt to make him see reason. Ah, Poirot said, but when one returns in secret, one does not do so for reason. One does so for revenge. Layton's eyes flared. You think I poisoned him. I think, Poirot said, rising, that you have lied about where you were, which, though not a crime in itself, is rather inconvenient when a man is found dead in the same building you claim to have left. As we stepped out, I whispered, Do you really think he did it? Poirot shook his head. Non, Hastings. He is a man of pride and bitterness, but not poison. He is hiding something, yes, but not the crime. We found Julian Arkwright precisely where one might expect a man like him to be at 10 in the morning, slouched in a leather-backed chair within the casino's card lounge, with a tumbler of whiskey and a cigarette perched precariously on the edge of an ashtray. Julian had the careless elegance of a man who had lived on luck and charm rather than discipline. His suit was crumpled, his tie askew, and yet he radiated the kind of dangerous charisma that made people overlook both. At our approach, he raised an eyebrow with something between amusement and irritation. Don't tell me you're here to take me in, he said, grinning. Non, monsieur, Poirot said smoothly. Not yet. Julian laughed. That's comforting. Poirot didn't return the smile. You were seen entering Monsieur Vance's suite last night. Julian stubbed out the cigarette. So what if I was? I went to see him. He invited me. Said he had a proposition. Something about a legacy wager. The man was always dramatic. Poirot tilted his head. And you left when? 11:10, Julian replied. He was alive and well when I walked out. Yet, I interjected, you're visible on the hallway footage at precisely 11:45. Julian blinked. That's not possible. The security camera must be wrong. Poirot raised a finger. Ah, but you see, monsieur, the security camera is precise. It does not forget. Which means someone, perhaps, has played with the time. Or with the truth. Julian stood and poured himself another drink. You're barking up the wrong tree. I didn't kill Reggie. Poirot leaned forward slightly. Non, Monsieur Arkwright. But perhaps you were meant to appear as though you had. There was a pause. You're suggesting someone framed me? Not framed, Poirot replied. Merely delayed, like a magician distracting with the left hand while the right commits the trick. As we left the card lounge, I glanced back. Julian was staring into his drink, more thoughtful than before. I don't like him, I said under my breath. Poirot gave a small smile. That, Hastings, is why he is useful. The man who invites suspicion is rarely the one who deserves it. Our next visit took us to the sunlit atrium of the resort spa, where Evelyn Drake, the former lover turned spiritual confidant, had retreated after the news of Vance's death. She was seated near the koi pond, a silk scarf wrapped like a serpent around her neck, and a deck of tarot cards laid carefully on the table beside her. I knew you'd come, she said before we had even introduced ourselves. You are clairvoyant, madame? Poirot asked, not unkindly. I'm sensitive to shifts, she replied. There was a change in the air last night, like the universe closing a door. I rolled my eyes slightly, but Poirot took her statement in stride. You were close with Monsieur Vance? He asked. Evelyn smiled, wistful. Once, a long time ago, before the money eclipsed the man, he sought me out recently, asked me to read for him. Poirot's eyes twinkled. Did he find the future comforting? She shook her head. He found it inevitable. He asked about the number 3, said it had followed him all his life. Birth, betrayal, business. He said he dreamed of it. 3 doors, 3 deaths, 3 losses. Fascinating, Poirot murmured. And what did the cards say? They warned of finality, a gamble that could not be undone. I told him not to take it, that the outcome was already written. Did you know what he meant by final bet? I asked. Evelyn looked at me, then back at Poirot. Only that he'd wagered something precious. Not money, something deeper. And he feared the loss more than death. Poirot studied her carefully. You speak in symbols, madame, but symbols often cloak the truth. She leaned in, voice low. We all wear symbols, monsieur. You wear order, I wear intuition. But even symbols bleed in the end. As we stepped outside, I asked, Do you believe any of that, Poirot? He nodded slightly. Not the predictions, Hastings, but the fear. That was real. Monsieur Vance did not fear dying. He feared losing something first. The concierge at the Casino Lucien was the sort of man one didn't notice, until it was too late. Luc Moreau had a presence as soft as silk and as polished as a ballroom floor. He was always there, behind a desk, at a corner, near a doorway, without ever seeming to arrive or depart. Poirot, of course, had noticed him immediately. You see, Hastings, he said, as we descended the marble staircase toward the lobby, in a house of secrets, it is the man who holds the keys who must never be underestimated. Luc stood behind his polished desk, adjusting a vase of white orchids. He gave a small bow when we approached. Messieurs, he said in a voice smooth as velvet. May I assist? I should be most grateful, Poirot replied. We have spoken with the guests, but now we must speak with the house itself, and that is you, monsieur. Luc inclined his head modestly. I observe. I do not interfere. But to observe is to know, Poirot replied. And you, I think, know very much. Luc considered that for a moment. Monsieur Vance was a complicated guest. He had many visitors, many habits, but he trusted few. Poirot leaned closer. And you were one of the few? A pause, then a small nod. He requested that certain packages be delivered discreetly. A private safe. Locked files. He once had me burn a letter unopened. What of last night? I asked. Luc hesitated. He hosted a gathering, just before midnight. 5 people. Then he dismissed them. Alone. Poirot's brows rose. But alone he did not remain, n'est-ce pas? Luc looked at him for a long moment. Then he said quietly, I heard a clock chime. 3 times. I frowned. Odd, there's no clock in his suite. Poirot's eyes sharpened. Just so. Luc said nothing further, but his stillness held weight. As we turned to go, Poirot murmured, He knows Hastings. He has seen the truth, but whether he hides it for loyalty or for guilt, we must determine. The next morning brought more than sea breeze and espresso. It brought confirmation that something essential was missing. We were seated in the reading room of the casino when Jacques Deroulard returned, pale-faced and visibly agitated. He carried with him a small brown folder, empty. The personal ledger of Monsieur Vance, he said, holding it out as though it might bite. It is gone. Poirot took it gently and examined the worn leather, now devoid of contents. It was kept in the safe, Deroulard continued, alongside a sealed envelope addressed to a lawyer in Geneva. The envelope is still there. But the ledger vanished. Mon Dieu, Poirot murmured. Someone has taken the mind of the man, even after his death. I peered over his shoulder. You think it contains something incriminating? No, Hastings, Poirot replied. Something revealing. Monsieur Vance was many things, but he was not careless. If he kept a coded ledger, encrypted bets, patterns, confidences, it was for a reason. And someone didn't want it found, I added. Just so. Poirot stood, his gaze sharp. It is time, mon ami, to revisit Monsieur Leighton. There is a knot in his alibi, and I intend to pull the thread. We found Leighton once again in the club lounge, this time deeply engaged in a game of patience, though it looked, from the number of discarded cards, that patience was wearing thin. Back so soon? He muttered. Poirot didn't waste time. Monsieur Leighton, you stated yesterday you left for Nice in the late afternoon. Leighton nodded. That's right. Poirot sat. But your assistant says you called her from the hotel telephone, and the records show that call took place at 11:18 p.m. Leighton's mouth tightened, and, Poirot continued, the casino valet says your car never left the property until well past midnight. Leighton sighed. Fine. I lied. I didn't want to be dragged into it. I went to see Vance. One last time. I was angry. He owed me. Poirot nodded slowly. And what occurred in this final visit? He dismissed me, coldly, said he'd written me out of his will, said I should place my bets elsewhere. I left. That's the truth. Poirot rose. You were dishonest, monsieur. That is troubling, but not damning. What concerns me more is what Vance meant by his final wager. Leighton looked puzzled. He said it wasn't money. It was everything. He wanted to die with the last laugh. Poirot's brow furrowed. Indeed. But when a man laughs at death, it is rarely because he has lost. It is because he thinks he has won. As we exited, I asked, Do you believe him now? Poirot hesitated. He lies, yes, but not about the murder. His lie was to protect pride, not guilt. But this missing ledger, this is the true fulcrum of the case. And whoever took it, Poirot's voice was low, is the one who feared its contents the most. The Riviera breeze carried the scent of salt and citrus as we returned to the Salon Bleu of the Hôtel des Vagues. It was a quiet chamber tucked away from the grander lounges overlooking the sea. Poirot had requisitioned it for what he called his séances de vérité, truth sessions, as it were. "Why here, Poirot?" I asked, glancing around at the pristine curtains and pale blue upholstery. He adjusted his cuffs. "Because, mon ami, the sea is impartial. It watches without judgment. It mirrors the face of guilt as easily as it does innocence." We'd arranged the salon like a drawing room, 2 armchairs opposite a chaise longue, a pot of fresh coffee between us, and my notebook at the ready. Poirot had insisted I take notes. Not, he said, because he would forget, but because I would. Our first visitor was already on her way. "I shall ask the questions," Poirot reminded me with a raised finger. "You, Hastings, must listen, but also observe. Your eyes, they are sometimes faster than your brain." I began, slightly offended, but was interrupted by a knock at the door. Poirot smiled. "Let us see what the sea brings in." Camille Vance entered the salon with elegance, her black dress clinging to her like a secret. She had changed her veil, I noticed, this one finer, almost translucent, and wore a new perfume, something powdery and expensive that filled the room like silk. Poirot stood and bowed. "Madame, thank you for accepting my invitation." "I assumed I had little choice," she replied coolly. "One cannot simply ignore Monsieur Poirot, can one?" "I should very much prefer that people did," Poirot said with a modest smile. "But alas, they rarely do." She sat with grace, crossing her legs. The diamond bracelet remained, glinting in the morning light. I caught a whiff of something beyond the perfume. Cigarettes, perhaps, or something more chemical. Poirot opened his notebook. "Forgive my directness, madame. When did you last enter your husband's suite?" Her eyes narrowed. "The day before his death. I brought him tea, that was all." Poirot nodded. "And yet, the valet says he brought tea that morning. A special blend. You requested it." She hesitated for the briefest moment. "Yes, I did. It was a gesture. We were estranged, but I still cared." "Even after the new will?" Poirot asked softly. Her expression flickered. "What will?" Poirot folded his hands. "Monsieur Vance intended to change it, to leave a portion of his estate to a certain foundation. A gesture, perhaps, of atonement." Camille's lips parted slightly. "That's absurd." Poirot tilted his head. "You did not know?" "No," she said, perhaps too quickly. Poirot leaned back. "I understand. Sometimes the fear of losing power can produce a grief, rehearsed in advance." She stood abruptly. "If you're accusing me—" "Non, madame," he said, raising a hand. "I accuse no one. I merely observe and remember." As she swept from the room, I turned to Poirot. "What was that about a will?" "There is no will, Hastings," he said. "Not yet. But there was the intention. And that, in matters of money, can be more dangerous than fact." Our next guest entered like a breeze from a darker season. Evelyn Drake wore a shade of deep forest green, her hair bound in a long braid, and her eyes shadowed with something I couldn't quite name. She carried a small black purse and set it down gently, as if it contained fragile truths. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice low and rich. "Do you believe the dead carry debts?" Poirot offered her a seat. "Madame, I believe it is the living who are burdened by such things. But the dead, they leave behind ledgers. Some we can read, some we must decipher." She smiled faintly and took her place. Reginald owed many debts, not all of them financial. "You were close once?" Poirot asked. "Years ago," she said. "Before the towers, the yachts, the fame. Back when he gambled only with cards." Poirot nodded. "And yet you came to see him before his death." "I didn't come," she said. "He summoned me. He said he needed clarity. He spoke of 3 numbers, 3 mistakes. He thought his time was running out. What did you tell him? She opened her purse and took out a tarot card. I told him death was not the end, but a transformation. I raised an eyebrow. Poirot remained still. And did he speak of fear? She nodded slowly. He feared obscurity, that he'd built an empire with nothing to show for it. He wanted to bet one last time, not for money, for meaning. Poirot studied her. And did he mention his son? That startled her. She blinked. Son? Poirot smiled gently. Forgive me, madam. A hypothesis only. Evelyn stood. If Reginald had secrets, I wasn't one of them, but I saw the toll they took. After she left, I looked at Poirot. He had a son? Non, Poirot said. But now, Hastings, I'm certain someone believed he should have. Julian Arkwright entered the salon like a man who had just stepped off the cover of a glossy magazine, though I suspected the cover would be folded under Financial Scandal Weekly rather than Society Life. His tan was too perfect, his cufflinks too shiny, and his grin had the sheen of a man who rarely regretted anything he said or did. Back for another round, Monsieur Poirot, he drawled, slumping into the chair opposite us as if it were his personal throne. You're persistent. I'll give you that. Poirot gave a delicate nod. Persistence is the virtue of the truly curious. Julian poured himself a drink from a small hip flask, ignoring the untouched coffee laid out for him. So, what are we dissecting today? My love life? My debts? My fashion sense? I am interested, Poirot said gently. In your chips. Julian blinked. My what? Casino chips, I clarified, though even I was confused. From your last visit. Julian laughed. I play every night, Captain. You'll have to be more specific. Poirot remained serene. And yet, the house register shows you cashed in your winnings 2 nights ago. Since then, you have played on credit. Curious for a man who always prefers to play with weight in his pocket. Julian sat up slightly. So what? I gave a few chips to Reggie, as a joke. High-stakes poker tradition. House to house. Nothing criminal about it. Non, Poirot agreed. Unless, of course, those same chips were missing from his private vault. Unless the amount missing was exactly the number given. And unless your name, Monsieur Arkwright, was conveniently scratched out of the guest log for that hour. Julian's grin faltered. Poirot leaned in. The bravado, it is impressive. But beneath it lies discomfort. Julian stood, brushing invisible lint from his lapel. I didn't kill him, if that's what you're fishing for. Poirot tilted his head. Ah, but someone wanted to paint you as if you might have. Julian left the room with a swagger not quite as firm as when he entered. I looked at Poirot. You think he's innocent? Poirot tapped the side of his temple. He is no angel, but he is not the devil we seek. Not this one. The morning sun had shifted by the time Luc Moreau returned to the salon, summoned quietly by Poirot with a handwritten note that read only, Time. Let us speak of it. Luc entered without drama, but his presence always carried a strange gravity. He moved with the silence of someone who had made observation into an art. He bowed to Poirot, nodded at me, and took the offered seat with precision. You heard a clock, Poirot began without preamble. Luc's brow furrowed slightly. Oui, just after midnight. 3 chimes. In Monsieur Vance's suite? Luc nodded. I was nearby, in the corridor. The sound was faint, not mechanical, software, but very distinct. Poirot steepled his fingers. There is no clock in that suite, Monsieur Moreau. Luc tilted his head, unbothered. Then the sound came from elsewhere, but I swear, it came from within. I glanced at Poirot. Perhaps someone brought a travel clock. Luc shook his head. Non. I know the acoustics of that corridor. It was not a small clock. The chimes echoed, like from a long case. Poirot's expression shifted subtly, his eyes narrowing. A grandfather clock. There is only one on that floor, in the old reading room, down the east wing. Luke gave a slight nod. That door was closed. Poirot stood, almost abruptly. Come, Hastings, bring your ears. We followed Luke through a narrow corridor to the east wing. There, tucked in a forgotten reading room lined with dust-laden encyclopedias, stood the clock. Poirot examined it for only a moment before pointing at its polished base. Footprints, he murmured. Fresh. Someone stood here recently. He checked the pendulum. It was still. It has not chimed in days, Luke confirmed. It is ornamental only. Poirot's voice became soft. Then someone wanted us to think the chime came from here. But they played a recording from Vance's suite. A speaker? I asked. Possibly, but more likely, Poirot replied. A telephone or a gramophone. Why? Poirot turned, eyes blazing with sudden clarity. To create a false moment in time, Hastings. A ghost chime. And in doing so, to anchor a lie. It was not Poirot's nose that led us to the fire. It was the smoke. We were passing through the rear corridor of the casino when the scent of something acrid drifted in, faint but unmistakable. Poirot paused, nostrils flaring slightly. Burnt dust, he murmured. And paper. Before I could react, an alarm began to wail, low at first, then piercing. We followed the source, along with a small crowd of concerned guests and security men, to the archival annex, a rarely accessed wing of the resort that housed old ledgers, surveillance backups, and transaction logs. A plume of smoke trickled from under the door. The door was forced open by a staff member, revealing chaos inside. Scorched shelves, ash-covered reels of tape, and the unmistakable smell of kerosene. A fire extinguisher hissed as a young maintenance man battled the last of the flames. The damage, though not total, had been surgical. Merde, muttered the casino director, Deroulard, arriving breathless. The backups. Poirot was already surveying the room, his eyes sharp behind the rising haze. Where were the surveillance logs stored, monsieur? Deroulard pointed to a shelf now reduced to blackened metal. There. Poirot gave a single nod. How unfortunate. I glanced around. Surely it was an accident. Poirot made a tutting noise. No, Hastings. An accident is sloppy. This was efficient, selective. Notice, the files to the left and right are untouched, but the logs between 11 o'clock and midnight. Gone. The time of Vance's death. A security officer appeared, rubbing the back of his neck. Cameras on this floor went dark for 10 minutes. We thought it was maintenance interference. Now, maybe not. Poirot straightened. We are in the presence of someone clever, not merely a killer, but a planner. Someone who plays not with cards, but with patterns. What now? I asked. Now, Poirot said quietly, we study the mind of Monsieur Vance. If we cannot find the truth in footage, we shall find it in numbers. Back in our suite, Poirot laid out a curious assortment on the coffee table. A casino printout of Reginald Vance's betting history, a handwritten journal page retrieved from a hidden drawer in his suite, and, of all things, a diagram of the Fibonacci sequence. You see, Hastings, Poirot said, tapping the spiral on the diagram. The great mathematician Fibonacci discovered a sequence in which each number is the sum of the two preceding. It occurs in nature, in art, and apparently in the death diary of Reginald Vance. He handed me the journal page. The numbers were scrawled in a neat but obsessive hand. 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, and so on. At first glance, Poirot continued, a harmless pattern. But look, beneath each number, he's matched a bet. I examined the list. Roulette bets, baccarat hands, even sports wagers, but the stakes aligned eerily with the numbers. The fifth entry had €5,000 staked, the eighth, 8,000. The 13th, however, was blank. What was he betting on? I asked. His life, Hastings, Poirot said solemnly. The 13th was his final bet, a gamble with no house, no game, only death. I stared at him. He was obsessed, Poirot went on, with patterns, with fate, and with proving that he could beat even the end itself. But someone else knew, someone who saw the pattern, perhaps even before Vance himself did, and chose to intervene. You mean they used the pattern? Poirot gave a small smile. They exploited it. They knew the 13th bet was coming, that it would appear as suicide, and they made certain that it did. Late that evening, Poirot stood on the balcony of our suite, gazing out at the ink-dark sea. The Riviera below was glittering with lights and murmurs, but the detective's expression was far from festive. "It is time," he said at last. "For what?" I asked, joining him with 2 glasses of wine. "To draw the curtain on the performance. The actors have played their parts. The false leads have led. The truth is now waiting in the wings. You know who did it. We, Hastings. And more than that, I know why." He turned to face me fully. "I have made arrangements. All the principal players will join us tomorrow at noon in the Grand Salon. There, I shall reveal the truth." "You're sure?" Poirot sipped from his glass. "There is only one person who had the motive, the means, and the mind to orchestrate such a precise illusion. And the others?" He nodded slowly. "They played their parts well, but in the end there can be only one conductor to such a symphony." I raised my glass. "Then here's to truth." He clinked it gently. "To justice, mon ami, and to the final bet." The Grand Salon of the casino. Lucienne had been rearranged. Gone were the baccarat tables, the roulette wheel, and the glittering lights. In their place stood a long oval table draped in velvet, surrounded by high-backed chairs. The curtains were drawn, the chandeliers dimmed. There was a hushed solemnity to the room now, a kind of theatrical tension, as if the room itself were holding its breath. Poirot stood at the head of the table, a small podium placed before him, his gloves folded neatly on the edge. "This," he murmured to me as we entered, "shall be our courtroom." The guests arrived one by one, each unaware of the other's invitation, but all clearly anticipating something. Camille Vance was the first to appear, dressed in crisp morning black and a pearl necklace that gleamed under the chandelier. Her face was unreadable. Victor Layton followed, jaw set, his suit impeccable, though a bead of sweat betrayed his unease. Julian Arkwright arrived with a smirk and a raised eyebrow. "Ah," he said, surveying the others, "so it's a theatre after all." Evelyn Drake, in flowing green and silk, swept in with her usual mysticism, clutching her tarot purse like a holy relic. And finally, Luc Moreau entered without flourish, pausing only briefly at the threshold before taking a quiet seat by the wall. Poirot waited until all were seated before stepping forward. "Mesdames et messieurs," he said, voice calm, deliberate and commanding, "you are here because you each played a role in the final hours of Monsieur Reginald Vance. Some knowingly, others not. But the time for shadows is finished. This room, it shall now be a chamber of clarity." He paused. The silence was absolute. "In a moment, I shall reveal to you who committed the crime, and how. But first, we begin with lies, with the man who said he was in Nice." All eyes turned toward Victor Layton. Victor Layton's fingers tightened around the glass of mineral water before him. I could see the telltale signs, the twitch of his jaw, the way his heel tapped faintly against the marble floor. a man prepared for confrontation, but not for truth. "Victor Layton," Poirot said, his tone clipped. "You claim to be in Nice on the night of Monsieur Vance's death." Victor nodded stiffly. "That's correct." "And yet," Poirot continued, "we have 3 points of contradiction. 1. A telephone call you placed to your assistant, made not from Nice, but from the hotel switchboard here. 2. The casino valet confirms your car remained parked in the underground garage until past midnight. And 3. Monsieur Hastings and I saw you, in person, walking along the promenade." Victor's brow furrowed. "Coincidence," he said. "I returned briefly. I'd forgotten something, that's all." Poirot stepped forward. "Non, monsieur, not all. You came back to confront Vance. You were enraged. You'd been cut out of his will. Your legacy, your years of business loyalty, gone. You had motive. I didn't kill him." "Perhaps not," Poirot said softly. "But you lied. And lies, monsieur, they are like oil upon water. They spread." Camille gave a sideways glance. Evelyn clutched her purse more tightly. Poirot continued. "You see, mes amis, Victor Layton was not the killer, but he was a distraction. His false alibi clouded the timeline. It made us look to the wrong hour, and in that confusion, another slipped in and out." Victor opened his mouth to protest, but Poirot silenced him with a gesture. "I do not blame you, monsieur. Pride, it is a cruel master, but your deception, though not murderous, allowed the murderer to cloak their actions in a haze of misdirection." Poirot turned, his gaze sweeping the room like a lighthouse beam. "And now we shall see who used that haze to commit the perfect illusion." Poirot turned his gaze from Victor Layton to the opposite end of the room, where Julian Arkwright lounged in his chair with an air of indifference that was just a shade too polished. "Monsieur Arkwright," Poirot said, clasping his hands, "your presence at the casino on the night of the murder is undeniable, but your movements, they are most curious." Julian raised an eyebrow. "I told you, I went to see Reggie. He invited me." "Indeed," said Poirot, "and security footage confirms you entered his suite at 11:45 p.m. "Exactly," Julian said, spreading his hands. "Which makes it rather hard for me to have poisoned him before that, doesn't it?" A few in the room exchanged glances. Julian leaned back, triumphant. Poirot's smile was thin. "Unless, of course, you chose the time the camera would believe you entered." Julian stiffened, the grin faltering ever so slightly. Poirot continued. "You see, mes amis, the footage captured Julian entering the suite. But something was amiss. The timestamp was precisely 1 hour out of sync." He reached into his pocket and produced a sleek gold timepiece. "This is Monsieur Arkwright's watch, set, as we see, to Central European time, not Riviera time." Gasps stirred around the table. Poirot nodded. "You wore the watch. You entered the room at 10:45. But because the camera's manual timestamp relied on your entry key card, which matched your watch, the recording showed 11:45. You created an illusion, a phantom hour." Julian tried to recover his composure. "I didn't know it would—" "But you did know," Poirot interrupted. "You knew the house cameras synced guest access to local time via your declared time zone. You exploited a detail few would notice, but I noticed." He turned to Hastings. "Remember, mon ami, the clock that should not chime. This is its twin, a false chime of time." Julian stood abruptly. "You can't prove—" "I do not need to prove," Poirot replied calmly. "Because you are not the killer. You are the illusionist. You tried to frame another, Victor Layton, by shifting your presence forward in time. A neat trick, but a trick nonetheless." If Julian looked shaken, Camille Vance looked carved from ice. Her gloved fingers remained motionless on the table, her face perfectly composed. Yet beneath the surface, I detected a tension I had not seen earlier. Poirot turned to her, his voice now softer, more deliberate. Madame Vance, you have, from the beginning, intrigued me. You grieve, yes, but with restraint. You weep, but only when watched. And you wear a bracelet, one which, curiously, no longer matches the original estate inventory. Camille blinked once. I'm not sure what you mean. Allow me to explain, Poirot said, reaching for a folder. The bracelet you wear now is a replica, the real one, along with several other pieces from your inherited collection, was pawned 6 days before your husband's death at a jeweller's in Nice. He held up a copy of the receipt. Camille did not speak. Poirot continued. You claimed no knowledge of your husband's intentions to alter his will. Yet days before his death, you liquidated assets, quietly, as if preparing for a different kind of inheritance. She cleared her throat. I needed cash. That's not a crime. No, madame, it is not, but it is suggestive. Of what? Premeditation, Poirot said simply. There was a murmur in the room. Poirot raised a hand. I do not accuse you of murder, madame. But your timing, it is unfortunate. You created an impression, unintentionally perhaps, of one who knew her husband's end before he did. Camille's mask cracked ever so slightly. He was unstable, talking of fate, of final bets. I thought he'd harm himself. Ah, Poirot exclaimed. But if you feared suicide, madame, why not go to the authorities, or to his doctor? Her voice lowered. Because I didn't think he'd go through with it. Not Reggie. Poirot turned toward the others. You see? Each of you had your role. Some lied for pride, others for gain, others still to protect the illusion. But the true culprit hid among you not in noise, but in stillness. He paused, letting the silence hang in the air. And now, he said, we come to the one who orchestrated it all. The Grand Salon had become silent again, eerily so. Even the clinking of Camille's bracelet had ceased. All eyes followed Poirot as he slowly walked to the end of the table, where Luc Moreau sat with the calm of a man resigned to the inevitable. You are a man of precision, Monsieur Moreau, Poirot said softly. Always present, never intrusive. A perfect concierge. The invisible hand that turns the wheels behind the curtain. Luc did not respond. Poirot continued, his tone smooth but piercing. You had access. You had opportunity. But more than that, you had the one thing no one else in this room possessed. The master key. There was a collective intake of breath. Poirot held up a small brass key, glinting under the chandelier. Recovered not from your waistcoat, monsieur, but from the lining of a cleaning apron. Hidden, but not well enough. The key to every private suite in the casino wing. Luc's eyes flicked once toward the key, then away. And on the night of Monsieur Vance's death, Poirot went on, you used it. He began to pace slowly. Let us recall the scene. Reginald Vance was alone in his room. He had dismissed his guests. He was preparing for what he believed to be his final bet, a theatrical gesture. But you, Monsieur Moreau, knew better. Poirot pointed to the decanter on the serving tray. You did not enter with force. You used the master key. You brought him a glass. Perhaps as a courtesy, perhaps pretending it was sent by the casino director. And into that glass, you placed poison. Not in the decanter. No. Vance was a meticulous man. He would notice a shift in scent. But a single glass. None. He would sip it without suspicion. Poirot gestured toward the phial in Hastings' lap. The toxicology confirmed the cyanide was present only in the residue of the drinking glass, not in the bottle, not in the air. And the room, the room was locked. From the inside. I blinked. Then how? Poirot raised a finger. Monsieur Moreau waited. He lingered in the corridor until the body had gone still. Then he returned once more with his key to remove all evidence. He slipped out again, locked the door behind him, and left the room, appearing undisturbed. Luke said nothing. He sat perfectly still. "But one detail betrayed you, monsieur," Poirot said. "The smell." Poirot turned to the others. "When Hastings and I entered the suite, I smelled two things: almonds and polish. The kind used on brass door handles. Recent. Fresh." He stepped back. "Only someone who locked that door from the outside, after poisoning the drink, would have left that trace. And only one man had the key." Luke folded his hands. "I did not know he would die that quickly," he said at last, voice calm. "But I knew he would die. I saw to that." The silence was thick after Luke's confession, but Poirot was not finished. "No, monsieur," he said gently, almost pityingly. "You saw to more than his death. You saw to his punishment. Because this was not merely a murder. It was an act of vengeance. A reckoning born not of money or power, but of blood." Luke looked up now, sharply. Poirot tapped the file again. "We found no trace of your name in the guest log, no connection to Vance in the public records, but hidden in his personal correspondence, never sent, but never destroyed, was a letter. Addressed to a boy named Lucien. A letter filled with remorse and cowardice." He stepped closer. "It was dated 27 years ago. A letter from a young entrepreneur, Reginald Vance, to a woman in Lyon, a former chambermaid, a woman dismissed quietly when she became pregnant." Luke's face had gone pale. "You are his son," Poirot said. "Illegitimate, hidden, forgotten." Camille gasped. Julian swore under his breath. Evelyn merely closed her eyes as though something had been confirmed. Poirot continued. "You were raised by your mother. You took her name. And when she died, you came here, to the Riviera, to the place where he now held court like a king. And you got close, silently, observing." Luke finally spoke. "He knew." Poirot nodded. "Yes, that was the true meaning of his final bet. Not a game of fortune, but a reckoning. He was planning to name you, publicly, as his heir." Poirot raised a folded paper. "This unsigned page was found behind a panel in the wine cellar. Hidden, yes, but not lost. It contained his instructions to donate his fortune, and to name Luke Moreau as his rightful son." Luke's hands trembled. "He wanted to win posthumously," Poirot said quietly, "to right a wrong with grandeur. But for you, it was too little, too late." Luke rose slowly. "He built empires while we scraped to eat. He sent nothing, not even a letter. And then he thinks a posthumous pardon is enough." Poirot bowed his head. "Number it is not enough. Not for a boy abandoned, not for a man made to watch from the shadows. But still, monsieur, it was not your right to decide how the story would end." Luke's voice was hollow. "Then who had the right?" Poirot looked around the table. "Perhaps no one. Perhaps that is the tragedy." And in that moment, even Hastings said nothing. The room was still, the kind of silence that comes after thunder. Luke had resumed his seat, hands folded. Camille looked away. Evelyn sat with her eyes closed, fingers resting on her tarot cards, as though they, too, were mourning. Julian tapped a single finger on the armrest, more out of discomfort than defiance. And then Poirot, with the precision of a master performer, delivering his final act, reached into the leather folder before him and removed a small unmarked book, worn, water-stained, and bound in faded navy leather. "The missing ledger," he announced. Gasps echoed. "Yes," Poirot said with dramatic calm. "It was not destroyed in the fire, though that was the intent. It was merely displaced." He turned the book in his hands. "I found it tucked behind a false panel in the wine cellar, wedged between two cases of Burgundy and a 1939 cognac Monsieur Vance never touched. He had hidden it not from the world, but from himself. Because what is contained in these pages is not merely numbers, it is confession. He opened the ledger and turned to the final page, holding it up for all to see. It is unsigned, and yet, unmistakably, his hand. It reads, "The final wager is not with the tables or the cards. It is with legacy. I leave what I built, not to those who stood beside me when I triumphed, but to the one who lived in my shadow, because I cast it there. Let it be known. Lucien Moreau is my son, my heir, and my redemption." A stunned hush settled over the room. Poirot closed the ledger with a soft but deliberate snap. Had this page been delivered, had Luc known of its contents, perhaps the final act would have been different. But alas, Monsieur Vance waited too long. Redemption, like justice, must be timely. He turned to Hastings, and for the first time that day, smiled, gently, with a trace of melancholy. "And thus, mon ami, the case is closed. A man died seeking absolution. A son killed seeking recognition. And the truth, as always, lay in the place least searched, between the dust and the wine, where memory ferments." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. "Poirot," I said quietly, "you really do make the ordinary extraordinary." "Mais oui, Hastings," he replied. "It is the little grey cells. Even in a wine cellar, they do not rest." Luc Moreau stood without hesitation. He did not tremble, did not avert his gaze, and made no attempt to flee. The stillness in the Grand Salon deepened, as if the very room held its breath, waiting for him to deny it. But denial never came. "There is nothing more to say," he said at last, voice low but unshaken. "He gambled with empires, with people's lives. I gave him his final wager, one he could not win." Poirot stood still, arms crossed, his gaze unreadable. Camille Vance exhaled sharply. "You poisoned him for revenge?" Luc turned toward her. "I poisoned him because he deserved justice, for the mother he discarded, for the life he denied me." Julien muttered something, but Poirot silenced the room with a quiet, "Let him speak." Luc's expression was neither remorseful nor triumphant. I worked beside him for 2 years, watched him charm governments, betray friends, destroy rivals with the flick of a signature. He had power, yes, but no conscience. And when he learned who I was, he did nothing. "But he was going to name you," Evelyn said quietly. Luc's eyes flicked toward her. Too little, too late. He waited until it made him look noble, until it became a gesture. I was not a gesture. I was his son. Poirot stepped forward, slowly. "And so you killed him, not in rage, but in calculation." Like one of his own wagers, Luc met Poirot's gaze. "Exactly. The final bet." Poirot said nothing for a moment, then gave a slow nod. "Then it is time the house collects." Security, who had been quietly summoned, stepped forward. Luc made no move to resist. He removed his gloves, his lapel pin, and walked out between them without looking back. It was over, but not done. The salon had emptied. The chairs were pushed back. The sunlight spilled in once again from the drawn curtains, dancing across the polished floor as if attempting to cleanse the weight that still lingered in the air. Poirot remained by the window, hands folded behind his back, staring out at the sea. I joined him, still processing everything that had been said and revealed. "You knew from the beginning," I said. "Didn't you?" Poirot gave a small shrug. "I suspected. But the truth, mon ami, it is like a fragile flame. It must be protected until it can stand on its own." We stood in silence for a moment, listening to the muffled sounds of the casino beginning to breathe again behind the walls. "He was a brilliant man," I offered. "Vance, I mean." For all his flaws, Poirot's eyes narrowed faintly. Oui, brilliant. Yes, but brilliance, Hastings, is nothing if it blinds one to the humanity of others. In the end, his greatest failure was not the fortune he built, but the people he left behind. I nodded. Do you think he would have followed through? Made Luc his heir? Poirot turned to me. Perhaps, or perhaps it was another game. We shall never know. He smiled faintly. But even the most selfish of men, Hastings, sometimes try, at the last hour, to buy redemption. It is not always accepted, but the attempt, that is worth noting. Back in our suite, I poured 2 glasses of brandy and sat opposite Poirot, notebook open. I'll admit, I said, I didn't see it coming. The watch, the clock chimes, the ledger. You saw through it all. Poirot chuckled softly. Because, mon ami, I did not look at the clues. I looked around them. He sipped his brandy. The chimes. Impossible, yes? Because the suite had no clock. Yet Luc heard them. That meant they were meant to be heard. A recording. Designed to create a false moment of death. And Julian's watch? I asked. A clever misdirection, Poirot said. He wanted Victor to appear guilty, but only a man with guilt of his own would devise such a ruse. And Camille? Her mistake, he said, was in believing that grief could be rehearsed, that a replica bracelet would not reveal the truth. And Luc? Poirot nodded slowly. Luc played the longest game. He had the keys, the patience, the motive buried in decades of silence, but in the end, it was his stillness that betrayed him. Everyone else moved. He did not. I sat back, shaking my head. It's incredible. Poirot smiled. It is simple, mon ami. The psychology, it never lies. The heart may conceal. The words may deceive. But the behavior always reveals. He stood, adjusting his cuffs. And now, he said, we have earned a rest. Even the little grey cells must nap, on occasion. The storm had passed, or rather, it had settled into silence. Later that evening, Poirot summoned me to the cellar beneath the resort, where barrels of wine slept in rows and the scent of old oak lingered in the air. He stood beside a narrow wall panel, now slightly ajar, revealing a niche not meant for storage, but for secrecy. He handed me a single sheet of thick paper. The ink had smudged at the corners. The handwriting, tight, slanted, and unmistakably Vance's, had faded slightly from the damp. It read, "In the event of my death, this document shall serve as a directive. I wish the sum total of my remaining fortune, after the execution of minor personal bequests, to be transferred to the Fondation des Orphelins de Guerre. No monuments, no statues, just this. Let something remain that I never built in life. R.V. There was no signature, no date, merely the final thoughts of a man who had built empires, but struggled to build meaning." Poirot folded the paper with care. "You see, Hastings," he said, "he did not plan merely to vanish. He planned to leave something behind. Not just scandal or spectacle, but atonement." I frowned. "You think he knew Luc might kill him?" "I think," Poirot replied. "He suspected someone might, and he left a legacy anyway, not of wealth, but of intention." "Will it be honored?" Poirot looked toward the wine barrels. "That is for the lawyers to debate. But in the moral court, mon ami, I believe he has made his move. One final gesture. One final bet." The Riviera shimmered with its usual charm the following morning. Sunlight danced over the waves as if nothing had changed. But I, for one, knew better. As Poirot and I prepared to depart, I turned to him. "You were right, of course, as always." He adjusted his cuffs and smiled faintly. "It is a terrible burden, Hastings." We both laughed softly. though it didn't quite reach the air between us. Still, I added, I'm not sure I understand why he left it all behind. The money, the power, the reputation. Poirot looked toward the sea. Because, mon ami, he said gently, there comes a moment, even for the most calculating of men, when one realizes the greatest gamble is not what one can gain, but what one chooses to give. I said nothing. Poirot turned back toward me, his eyes gleaming with quiet fire. And sometimes, Hastings, justice is not about punishment. It is about clarity, about lifting the veil. And when that is done, tout est fini. With a final nod, he stepped into the waiting car. And thus ended the curious affair of the billionaire's final bet.